Hi, I'm Stefania Barca, and I'm going to talk to you about degrowth, work, and the environment. My presentation is mostly based on a book chapter entitled An Alternative Worth Fighting For, Degrowth and the Liberation of Work, which is part of the collective volume Towards a Political Economy of Degrowth, published by Roman and Littlefield in 2019. My overall argument is that degrowth must mean liberation not just from work, but of work itself, meaning a liberation of waged workers from their current subjugation to the growth economy. I will first briefly summarize the liberation from work argument that characterizes the current degrowth perspective on work. Then I will explain how waged work is relevant as a subject of degrowth theory and praxis, and I will elaborate on how waged work itself might be liberated from growth. I will conclude with an overview of the Green New Deal for Europe campaign and how it can configure a degrowth strategy on work and environment in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's start from the liberation from work argument. This is as old as the degrowth idea itself. In fact, it can be traced back to André Gortz, one of the first public intellectuals to ever mention the word degrowth or décroissance back in the mid-1970s. Gortz is especially known for his Farewell to the Working Class, published in 1980, where he re-elaborated ideas that came from the Italian autonomist Marxist movement, or workerism. The main idea was that waged work can never emancipate people. In fact, it makes us slaves of capitalist valorization and the logic of exploitation. And this awareness gives us a right to refuse it, to refuse waged work, to search for and affirm our true value elsewhere. Gortz believed that true progress and emancipation would come from a post-work society, in which waged work would be reduced to the minimum indispensable. This idea originated the main degrowth perspective on work, that of the reduction of working time, expressed through proposals for a universal basic income and a reduced work week, in order to give people as much freedom as possible from waged work. At the same time, however, a feminist argument for the refusal of waged work had developed from an autonomous women's movement. This is known as the Wages for Housework campaign. But contrary to what many critics claim, its aim was that of liberating women from the traditionally assumed and unwaged role of domestic workers and caregivers. Feminists claimed that social reproduction was valuable work because it produced the most important resource for a capitalist society, labor power, and thus they claimed it should have been paid through a proper wage. What is most relevant to degrowth from this movement is that they rejected the idea that women's emancipation would come from getting jobs in the industrial economy, thus becoming subjugated to exploitation both outside and within the home. This refusal of waged work as a necessary route to progress and liberation was then picked up from the ecofeminist movement, and especially through the subsistence perspective, and originated a specific feminist contribution to degrowth. Ecofeminism claimed that since the growth society undervalued reproductive work, it also undervalued and thus destroyed life itself. The movement brought to light how women's unwaged reproductive work constituted a valid alternative with the power to protect and regenerate life, including non-human nature. The Green Belt movement of Kenya, led by a woman agrarian scientist, Wangari Maathai, in which women had taken the autonomous initiative of replanting millions of trees in order to get access to food and subsistence means, and in the process reforesting a heavily eroded soil, constituted the perfect example of what kind of work was to be socially valued for ecofeminism. Finally, the diverse economies concept and the community economies collective of activist scholars based in Australia can be considered an important source of inspiration from the degrowth argument of liberation from waged work. Based on feminist political economy, in the late 90s, J.K. Gibson Graham offered a very clear representation of the relationship between waged and unwaged work in the capitalist economy, the iceberg, where unwaged work appeared as very much majoritarian and also fundamental to sustain the value produced through waged work. This view is highly relevant to a liberation from work perspective because recognizing that most wealth and well-being come from the base of the iceberg rather than the tip means we can reduce the tip to a minimum. The liberation from work perspective is certainly key to degrowth theory and politics, but its disadvantage is that it leaves waged work out of the picture as a subject of transformation. It accepts that waged work is inevitably tied to degrowth society. This is a problematic position for three reasons. First, because waged work is not disappearing. In fact, it is increasing globally as more people are becoming proletarians due to constant processes of original accumulation and need a wage to survive. At the same time, working conditions are worsening and the rate of exploitation is accelerating due to the accelerating social metabolism. All this tells us that it has become more important than ever to actively involve waged work in a degrowth transformation. Second, because waged work is a key mediator of social metabolism. That means that it is workers who materially manipulate matter and energy, and thus they also have the power to stop or change how this is done. This makes waged work key to a degrowth transformation from below. That is, decoupling employment and wealth from material throughput. Third, it's because trade unions, labor organizations, and movements are in transition. The Fordist model of labor organizing, which was complicit in the treadmill of production, the Fordist pact between labor, capital, and the state, is definitely dismantled, and unions are in the process of remaking themselves in the dual context of global neoliberalism and the planetary ecological crisis. New forms of labor organizing are emerging in this context, such as digital platforms of global labor solidarity or social movement unions like the Via Campesina or the Brazilian MSP. It is vital that this new era of labor organization be informed by a degrowth perspective, and indeed, there is now a real possibility that this is so. In short, to develop a degrowth strategy for the liberation of work, we need to ask the question, how can the emancipation and well-being of waged workers and the social welfare associated with it be decoupled from GDP growth and the increase of social metabolism? So how can waged work be liberated from growth? In my book chapter, I highlighted three pathways that, to me, represent ways in which waged work can and is already struggling for its own liberation from the growth machine. The first of the three pathways is what I call working class environmentalism. To me, this means the specific basic forms of environmental mobilization that characterize working class communities. These mobilizations are around the hazards of industrial production, broadly intended to include agribusiness, mining, and waste disposal, and other activities. Working class environmentalism emerges when struggles at the point of production coalesce with struggles in reproduction, that is, community struggles for environmental justice. This coalition allows working class people to reject the jobs blackmail that has forced them to accept a trade-off between their income on the one hand and their health and environmental health on the other hand. Contesting the jobs blackmail leads communities to ask, what is the alternative worth fighting for? And to start talking about a possible plan B. So this opens the way to a second pathway towards the liberation of waged work, that of a just transition towards a post-carbon economy, one that would address both social and environmental justice by creating decent employment in decarbonizing the economy, while also redistributing access to energy and relocalizing production as much as possible. This is the strategy proposed by the Global Climate Jobs Campaign and also by the Green New Deal. I will talk more in depth of this in the next two slides. Third, there is the possibility of occupying production, literally speaking, that is, reclaiming the means of production, land, factories, digital platforms, via direct workers' control, even if this does not necessarily imply seizing power at the state level. For example, workers' recuperation of failed, dismissed, or abandoned workplaces has been happening since the 2008 financial crackdown, starting in Argentina and extending to Greece, Italy, and other places worldwide. Also, landless workers' occupation of land is a longer-lasting movement, especially strong in today's Brazil with the Sem Terra movement. These occupations and workers' self-organized production too often lead to a decrease in material throughput and more sustainable modes of production. For example, the Sem Terra have officially adopted agroecology. But now let me focus on, give you some reflections on a platform for political strategizing that has been emerging in the past year, the Green New Deal for Europe, not to be confused with the Green Deal approved by the European Commission in January of 2020. The Green New Deal for Europe is an alternative plan for just transition to the post-carbon economy, based on concepts and struggles emerging from the grassroots, and more specifically from climate justice, feminist, peasant, labor, community economy, and degrowth movements. Here I want to talk about how this alternative Green New Deal reflects degrowth possibilities for liberation from and of work. In terms of liberation from waged work, the plan includes proposals for a 4-day working week with equal pay and measures for income guarantee to workers in phased-out industries so that they won't have to worry about finding new paid jobs. It also includes provisions for indirect income through public housing and public services such as free transport, healthcare, education, culture. It includes low-cost utilities and access to the digital commons. The GNDE allocates funds to make all these services accessible freely or low-cost to everyone, including in rural areas. The plan then demands the institution of a care income, perhaps the plan's most innovative proposal, originating from a convergence between the wages for housework movement and the degrowth movement. The care income would also liberate people from waged work because it would allow us to work less for a wage and more for ourselves, our families, and our communities, and the preservation of the natural and the built environment of which we are part. I'm going to better explain this idea in my last slide, focusing on a specific campaign that has been developed around this proposal as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. First, however, let's address those other aspects of the GNDE that relate to the liberation of work. Like other GND plans, this one too revolves around the idea that a post-carbon transition will not come around by simply stopping to consume natural resources, but it will necessarily imply an economic and technical reconstruction, and this will have to involve workers. Unlike other plans, however, the GNDE claims that this reconstruction will have to happen in the absence of GDP growth, and rejects the idea of green growth as problematic and ultimately unrealistic. Full employment will have to be guaranteed through a diversity of activities that include not only industrial production, but also social and environmental reproduction. For example, many new jobs will be created in refurbishing and retrofitting buildings for public housing, existing buildings, without the need to building new houses, or in maintaining healthy forests and preventing wildfires, or in supporting sustainable and socially just food production. These new climate jobs will be free from the treadmill of production that tied waged work to exploitation and to the destruction of the environment. Thus, they will allow for a liberation of waged work. But the plan also introduces a number of other proposals that aim at de-alienating waged work and empowering workers, like, for example, it allows for retraining workers from phased-out industries so that their technical and managerial expertise can contribute to develop the climate jobs. The direct involvement of waged workers in the transition is also incentivized through proposals for participatory management and for workers' ownership funds, through support to workers' cooperatives and municipal services, and by democratizing research and development so that innovations are socialized and not privatized. This would liberate also research and knowledge workers in general from their current tie to private industry and to GDP growth. In short, once growth is not the primary aim of governments anymore, waged work can be liberated from and empowered so it can become a driver for transformation. So let me conclude by zooming into the care income proposal. As I mentioned before, this originated from a convergence between the former wages for housework campaign and the degrowth perspective. The common starting point is a call for reconstructing the economy by valuing reproductive and care work, which is universally associated to women. In fact, UN and ILO and Oxfam data tell us that women and girls today do more than 3/4 of all unpaid care work, 12.5 billion hours a day globally. This work consists in life support services in households, in communities, and in the environment, both urban and rural. The COVID-19 pandemic has made two things clearer than ever. First, that this is truly essential work. Second, that too much of this work is unwaged and carried on in undignified conditions, while it continues to be taken for granted, even now that it is subjected to increased pressure and risk due to the pandemic. The Care Income campaign starts from the assumption that the COVID-19 pandemic itself results from a historic tendency to devaluing and taking for granted care work, which is the fundamental premise for the GDP growth model. To reverse this trend, the campaign calls for valuing care by supporting the caregivers, those whose work is aimed at the well-being of people and the planet. The campaign connects with the ecofeminist refusal of waged work in the growth economy as a pathway to wealth and emancipation. In this sense, the care income is a form of liberation from waged work. At the same time, the campaign demands that the care income be funded by redirecting public money from the war industry and from industrial agribusiness. Its motto is "Invest in caring, not killing." In this sense, the care income would significantly contribute to degrowth in stopping two of the most powerful drivers of environmental degradation worldwide. Okay, this presentation stops here, but I invite you to read the linked documents that you can find in this and the previous slide, the Blueprint for Europe's Just Transition and the Letter to Governments of the Care Income Campaign, and take note of your questions and comments so we can have an informed conversation on the live session of July 31st. Thank you and see you there.